But I'm going to start this discussion about education by just explaining to you that with May-Wright Sewall, she was a scrapbooker, okay? Warriner was not, at least we don't have scrapbooks by Warriner. Actually, there are some photo books, but mainly we have speeches and papers and handwritten essays and so forth. In May-Wright Sewall's case, the Clarke has a number of scrapbooks. This is my favorite one, actually. And just so you can have an idea, some of them have just newspaper cutouts, and you can spend hours just reading these papers, okay? And there's some other scrapbooks. Some of them have buttons, so actual, tangible memorabilia, real treasures. There's another button from 1904, a pin. And this is like a sort of program from a peace conference in 1908 in Philadelphia. And what's so interesting is, I don't know if you recognize, but that's the Peace Palace that you saw. But this is 1908, and the Peace Palace was not built until 1913. So anyway, there was something growing, something live and growing here. So these are just some of the things that are in her scrapbook, but this is one of my favorites. You probably have heard of Susan B. Anthony, the most probably well-known women's rights activist in the United States. And this is actually in May-Wright Sewall's scrapbook. And what this is, and it's so poignant that you have a yellow and a maroon and gold ribbon binding this program for Susan B. Anthony's 80th birthday. This is her 80th birthday celebration. And I start with this piece not only to give you an idea of what's in May-Wright Sewall's scrapbooks, but also because to have you appreciate where women's education was. Susan B. Anthony has an interesting story. So she is born in 1820. And when she is maybe like 10 or 11 or something like this, she's in school. Her teacher is a man. And he refused to teach the girls long division because they're girls. And Susan B. Anthony is a Quaker. And if you know anything about the Quakers, they believe in the total equality of men and women. So Susan B. Anthony goes home and tells her father, oh, they're not teaching me long division because I'm a girl. And her father pulls her out of the school and finds like a tutor for her. So that's probably around, 1832 or something like this. Okay, so, and that's in New York. And depending on where you were in the country determined what kind of opportunities were available to you. And May-Wright Sewall was from the Midwest. And in the Midwest, there really were not a lot of good educational opportunities for women. One of the first women's colleges to be created was called Northwestern Women's College. I imagine that Northwestern arose out of it because it's in Evanston, Illinois. I haven't researched that. But May-Wright Sewall went there. And that was and it was founded by two brothers actually, Northwestern Female College. And May-Wright Sewall refers to the beginnings of this work on women's education as the feeble beginnings. And May-Wright Sewall loved books. She loved to read. She was, a sort of, cerebral young woman. And she was really searching for some experience, some like culture. It didn't exist, so she created it with her husband. And so the feeble beginnings of the higher education movement for women, and realize that when we're talking about education here, and May-Wright Sewall makes this distinction between formal education, like actual going to class, and informal, or she uses this word, irregular education, which is like what we're doing. Lectures, sort of public lectures, someone comes and gives a talk somewhere, or you go on a trip and you educate yourself with your friends, this kind of thing. So she makes this distinction, and she is a force for both formal education and this irregular education, as you'll see. Also, I wanted to acknowledge that the work on female education is far from over, and this is Malala Yousafzai, who you may know was shot in the head by the Taliban for being an outspoken advocate for girls' education. And she won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. So there's still so much work to be done, I would say, in this country and, of course, in other countries as well. So I just wanted to make that connection. We're far from there. So what does May-Wright Sewall do? So formally, she creates the Girls' Classical School. And this is an operation from 1882 to 1907. And importantly, she does this with her husband. I'm very interested in the sort of partnerships that existed between men and women during this time period. And absolutely, her husband was a huge supporter of her dream. He was there helping her. They did not have any children, and this is what they did. And he died before the school closed, so she was sort of running it by herself for a while. And this is formal education. This quote is on your handout, so if it's easier to read on your handout, you can follow along there. And this is Julia Ward Howe, who actually was one of the founders of Mother's Day, which was originally Mother's Peace Day. But she says, "Women, I speedily found, were too little accustomed to the habit of thinking. Each of them was too much of a personal sovereign, holding her little court, curtained off by her little chimeras, with too little knowledge of the world's affairs." And actually, you see this repeated. May-Wright Sewall points out, like, women really don't know anything about suffrage. They just don't know. They're sort of very, very private. They're not aware of these movements, and this was a problem. So one of the things that the Girls' Classical School did, I love this because this is a field trip. The Girls' Classical School was based in Indianapolis, and this is May-Wright Sewall with her husband Theodore. So that's May, and that's Theodore. And they're with 9 students, and they go to Washington, D.C. to learn about George Washington by going to his house. Okay? So it's early study abroad. Okay? And I love that. And it's, a sort of very rich education. And in addition to that, the people who would come in and guest lecture at the Girls' Classical School were people like, and Susan B. Anthony did come in and guest lecture. Can you imagine? So the reformers of the day would come in. So they were learning Latin, they were learning Greek, they were learning math, and then they were learning about the social reforms from the people who were actually doing it. And they were going on study abroad trips to George Washington's house. Really, really rich education. So if you're interested in that, one of her scrapbooks does have the actual, like, some of the curricula, some of the faculty, and some of the programs at the Girls' Classical School. In terms of this informal, irregular education, this is one of the things that she does. This is the propylaeum. Propylaeum coming from the Greek, which means gateway. And they refer to this as the gateway to culture. The gateway to culture. This was the second location of the propylaeum. But this was completely owned by women. They formed a stock company in 1888. They wanted their own space. And it's kind of like isn't there like a space perhaps in the UC where all student organizations have a little desk, so it was like this, but for women's organizations. And they could have lectures, they could have meetings, they could, use the space, but it was very important for them to own it because they had always been using, for their own lectures and events, men's spaces. And they wanted to be able to offer to men, their space. I don't know if that actually happened. It's an interesting research project to see if men actually used the propylaeum. But this is one of the things that she did. So she's creating this center for culture, for this irregular education, for people to come in when they can and learn. That's another picture of it. And if you're interested in having a meaningful wedding destination, there are people who, it still exists. You can go there and you can get married at the propylaeum. So he doesn't look very excited about it, but anyway. Okay. So this is in Indianapolis, and this is May working at a kind of local grassroots level. with this irregular education. But she also does irregular education at the global level. And this is what I think is very, very, very fascinating. And this happens in 1888. So this organization is formed called the International Council of Women in 1888. This is when women organize internationally. And it is, May-Wright Sewall says, it's Susan B. Anthony's idea. But Susan B. Anthony is getting old. Okay? It's Susan B. Anthony's idea for women to organize internationally, and May is like 24 years younger, and so she says, do this. And May does it, actually. And what is this? This is its own talk, but again, 1888. And one of the things I love about the International Council of Women is it's intergenerational. This is a beautiful picture. That's Susan B. Anthony. She's 68 years old there. And this is Rachel Foster Avery, who's 30. And they were both involved in the making of this thing. So you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's in her 70s. This is May-Wright Sewall. She's in her 40s. Anna Howard Shaw, 40s. And Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross, was also involved, 67. So it's intergenerational, and that's something that I think needs to be remembered. And this is from the preamble. This kind of summarizes what they were doing. This should be on your handout as well. So it says, we women of all nations do hereby band ourselves together in a confederation of workers committed to the overthrow of all forms of ignorance and injustice and to the application of the golden rule to society, custom, and law. This was not just about suffrage. This is why it's, I think, radical. It was, let us just get women who are already organized in a group for some cause, because women were organized. Temperance, peace, education, suffrage. They were organized. They had a command structure, if you will. And it was, let us all come together because we're all working on similar things. And yes, there are differences, but there are some commonalities that we can leverage. And this is the main objective, to overthrow all forms of ignorance and injustice and to apply the golden rule to society. The golden rule, some of you may not know, but it's, I like to put it in the more positive way, treat others the way you want to be treated. The other way of putting it is don't do to others what you do not want done to you, and they're actually a little bit different. And this, to sort of sum up what their objective is here, is to humanize statecraft, to make the state, to make law and policy more human, more gentle. And this is a quote from Bertha von Suttner, and she puts it this way as well. This is from 1911. She was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and she inspired Nobel to create the Peace Prize. She says, politics can only develop into a state worthy of our progressing civilization if the essentially female qualities of gentleness and dignity would penetrate political life.